If you've ever driven the back roads of West Virginia and felt like the hills were holding secrets, you're not imagining it. Tucked into these valleys and along these rivers are places where whole lives unfolded and then slipped away, leaving behind brick shells, rusting steel, and stories that most people never hear. We're counting 10 of them, and I'm willing to bet at least a few will be brand new to you. Number 10. Sewell, Fayette County. Sewell was never built to be famous, it was built to be useful. In the late 19th century, along the New River, it grew around coke production, which was one of the most important industrial processes of its time. Coal was packed into stone ovens and heated until nearly everything but carbon was burned out, producing the fuel that helped power iron and steel manufacturing across the country. That meant Sewell existed at the exact intersection of West Virginia coal and American industry. The mines fed the ovens fed the furnace, and the furnaces fed the expansion of cities hundreds of miles away. What that looked like on the ground was a town where nearly everything revolved around work. Company houses lined the slopes, families bought food and supplies from the company store. Men came home carrying coal dust in every fold of their clothing, and children grew up in the shadow of ovens, glowing hot enough to help build a nation they would probably never see. Like so many industrial communities in Appalachia, Sewell was not luxurious, but it was alive. People made gardens where they could. They raised children, shared meals, paid debts, and lived ordinary lives in a place that existed for a very specific purpose. Then the world changed. Steel production evolved, larger and more efficient operations took over, and small coke centers like Sewell became less and less practical. There was no single dramatic disaster that erased it, no famous final day, just a steady loss of purpose. As jobs disappeared, families left, houses emptied. The routines that had held the place together slowly unraveled until by the early 1970s, the last resident finally walked away. Today, the town lies inside Babcock State Park, and if you know where to look, the old coke ovens are still there in the woods. Their brick walls are cracked, trees push up through the ruins, and hikers pass by with no idea they are walking through what used to be the center of a working town. That quiet disappearance is what makes Sewell so striking. It didn't explode, it didn't wash away, it was simply outlived. Number 9. Nuttallburg, Fayette County. If you want a place that still feels suspended in time, Nuttallburg is one of the most unforgettable in the state. Getting there is part of the experience. There is no easy road leading casually into town. To reach the site, you descend a long staircase into the New River Gorge, and by the time you get to the bottom, it already feels like you've stepped out of the modern world. Then the structures come into view, and the first impression is not of a few scattered ruins, but of an industrial complex that looks as if the workers left and never returned. Nuttallburg developed as a coal operation tied directly to the geography of the gorge. The cliffs were steep, the terrain was unforgiving, and moving coal out required serious engineering. The solution was a massive tipple and conveyor system built into the mountainside so coal could be loaded directly onto rail cars below. It was a remarkable arrangement, and one that made the town one of the major coal shipping points in the gorge. Once the railroad network made extraction profitable on a large scale, communities like this could spring up fast. Houses, school, store, and all the basic pieces of town life followed the mine. That life was shaped by isolation. In places like Nuttallburg, families were close not because it was quaint, but because survival demanded it. Everyone depended on the same operation. Everyone knew what happened if production slowed. Men disappeared underground every morning and came back up if the day went well. Women managed households in a place where access was difficult and resources were controlled. Children grew up in a town that had one reason to exist and no backup plan if that reason failed. And eventually it did. As coal seams thinned and the economics shifted, the operation lost its viability. By the mid-20th century, the community emptied out. What remains now is some of the most vivid industrial preservation in West Virginia. Huge pieces of equipment still stand. Rows of coke ovens remain in the undergrowth. Rusted machinery clings to the hillside. Safety signs still hang where workers once saw them every day. There's something eerie about that level of preservation. In many abandoned towns, time scatters everything. Here, Time seems to have frozen it, as if the next train should still be arriving. Number 8. Volcano, Wood County. Long before America's biggest oil stories shifted westward, West Virginia had its own oil boom communities, and Volcano was one of the most remarkable. In the mid-19th century, this place grew quickly around petroleum production and briefly became one of the state's energetic little industrial outposts. It had the essentials of a prospering town and the confidence that prosperity tends to create. Businesses opened, workers came in, infrastructure expanded. For a while, Volcano looked like the future. Its very name captured the intensity of the place. Oil towns often carried that sense of urgency, as if the ground itself had become a source of instant transformation. And for a while it had. But boomtowns are often fragile beneath the surface. They depend on commodity prices, investor interest, transportation links, and the constant belief that tomorrow will keep paying better than today. Once any of those pieces slip, the confidence can vanish quickly. For Volcano, one of the decisive blows came in the form of fire. In 1879, a major blaze tore through the town's business district and destroyed critical buildings. Under other circumstances, a prosperous and promising place might have rebuilt. But the larger energy economy was already shifting. Competition for more productive oil regions was pulling attention elsewhere, and the appetite to pour money back into Volcano simply wasn't there. The fire didn't just damage buildings, it exposed how fragile the town's future already was. After that, rebuilding never truly happened, and the population faded away. Today, the town is largely remembered through historical interpretation rather than a large surviving physical footprint. That almost makes the story stranger. A place that once mattered to the early development of American oil now survives mostly as memory, documentation, and a few traces on the landscape. It's one of those reminders that a town can be important in its own time and still nearly vanish from public memory afterward. Number 7. Thurmond, Fayette County. Thurmond is one of those places that sounds exaggerated until you look at the numbers. In the early 20th century, this tiny rail town generated enormous freight business and served as a major stop in the coal economy of southern West Virginia. For a place so small, it punched absurdly above its weight. At its height, the town had hotels, banks, restaurants, stores, and all the energy you would expect from a rail hub tied directly to money and movement. The reason was simple. Steam railroads needed service. Locomotives had to stop for water, coal, maintenance, and crew changes, and a strategic rail town could thrive by providing all of it. Thurmond became one of those places where trains, miners, merchants, and travelers all intersected. You can imagine how alive it must have felt when the depot was busy, the streets were active, and business moved to the rhythms of train schedules and freight demand. Towns like this often seemed permanent because the system around them was so vast. Coal was moving, railroads were expanding, the need felt endless. But the technology that created Thurmond also sealed its fate. As diesel locomotives replaced steam engines, trains no longer needed the same kind of support infrastructure. They could travel farther, more efficiently, with fewer of the stops that towns like Thurmond depended on. That meant a place once positioned perfectly only inside the old system suddenly became much less necessary inside the new one. And once the rail economy stopped feeding the town began to empty. What remains is one of the most atmospheric small historic districts in the state. The old depot still stands. The commercial buildings are still there. The tracks still carry trains. Amtrak even stops there, which makes the scene feel surreal. A passenger can step off into a place where the architecture of the boom years is still visible, but the life that animated it is mostly gone. Thurmond doesn't feel erased. It feels paused, and that may be even more haunting. Number 6. Bramwell, Mercer County. Bramwell is different from many of the places on this list because it was not a rough camp or an isolated industrial outpost. It was wealth made visible. Around the turn of the 20th century, Bramwell became famous for having an astonishing concentration of millionaires, thanks largely to the coal fortunes flowing out of southern West Virginia. The Pocahontas coal field produced some of the most valuable coal in the region, and the people who profited from it turned Bramwell into a showcase. The homes tell that story better than any statistics can. Grand residences rose along the streets, built with decorative detail and imported materials that set them apart from ordinary mountain towns. This was not a place of company shacks and muddy footpaths. This was a place where the upper tier of the coal world lived in comfort and style, close enough to the industry to benefit from it, but far enough above the day-to-day labor to be insulated from much of its hardship. Yet Bramwell's decline shows that even wealth has limits when the larger system changes. The Great Depression hit hard. Coal markets contracted, banking troubles spread, railroad patterns changed. The local economy could no longer sustain the same level of influence or luxury it once had. Over time, the fortunes thinned, and the town settled into something much quieter than its peak had promised. What makes Bramwell so memorable today is that much of the built environment still exists. The houses remain. The streets still suggest the scale of past prosperity. It doesn't look like a vanished mining camp swallowed by woods. It looks like a place where grandeur survived after the world that funded it receded. Walking through Bramwell is like walking through a chapter of coal history that forgot to disappear. It's one of the best examples in West Virginia of how abandonment doesn't always mean total ruin. Sometimes it means a dramatic shrinking of importance, while the physical symbols of success remain standing. Number 5. Matewan, Mingo County. Matewan is not abandoned in the same way some of these other places are, but it belongs on this list because its most important story comes from a vanished world. If you know anything about American labor history, the name probably rings a bell. If you don't, this is one of the places where the balance of power between coal companies and miners was challenged in a way that would echo far beyond West Virginia. In the early 20th century, Matewan sat in the middle of a tense and dangerous coal landscape. Companies controlled jobs, housing, and often much of the daily structure of life. Union organizing threatened that control, which meant labor disputes were never just about pay. They were about authority, dignity, and who had the right to shape the conditions of work. When miners in the area pushed toward unionization, private detectives were brought in to intimidate, evict, and suppress. That pressure exploded in 1920 in what became known as the Matewan Massacre. After conflict over evictions and organizing a gun battle broke out in town between Baldwin Felts agents, local law enforcement, and miners. When it ended, multiple people were dead, including agents, townsmen, and the mayor. It was not an isolated episode of violence, it was a turning point. The confrontation helped set the stage for a much larger labor conflict in the region, including the march toward Blair Mountain. What makes Matewan powerful today is that the town still holds visible links to that era. Buildings remain. The depot has been preserved. Bullet marks and historical sites tie the present streetscape to one of the fiercest struggles in American labor history. The world that produced that violence is largely gone now. The coal camp system of total control has weakened, changed, or collapsed in many places. But Matewan remains as a physical reminder of what people were willing to risk when every part of life could be controlled by the company that signed your paycheck. Number 4. Kaymoor, Fayette County. Few abandoned places in West Virginia feel as physically dramatic as Kaymoor. It sits deep in the New River Gorge, and getting there is not easy. Visitors descend hundreds upon hundreds of stairs into a landscape where the mine structures seem to emerge out of the forest like the bones of something enormous. Even before you know the history, the setting tells you this was a difficult place to build a life. Kaymoor opened at the end of the 19th century and became a major coal producer. Millions of tons of coal came out of this operation over the decades, and all of it depended on a workforce willing to live in a steep, isolated environment organized almost entirely around the mine. Houses stood near the operation, children attended the local school, and the company church served as one of the few spaces not directly defined by extraction. But even then, the mine still ruled everything. The work was dangerous, the terrain demanding, and the future of the town tied to forces far beyond the people living there. When serious damage and changing economics hit the operation in the mid-20th century, Kaymoor's fate was sealed. Once the mine shut down, there was little reason for the community to remain. Like so many one-industry towns, it had not been built to diversify. It had been built to extract, ship, and endure for as long as that was profitable. After that, nature began reclaiming the site. Today, the remains are extraordinary. Conveyor structures, foundations, rail traces, and industrial components still sit in the gorge. The silence is part of the experience. You can read interpretive signs and to understand the facts, but the stronger impression comes from the setting itself. You realize how far workers had to travel, how closed in the valley is, and how much energy it must have taken to sustain daily life there. Kaymoor does not just tell you about coal, it makes you feel the geography that shaped it. Number 3. Coalwood, McDowell County. Coalwood is one of the most emotionally layered places on this list because it is tied not just to industrial history, but to aspiration. Founded in the early 20th century as a company town, Coalwood became part of McDowell County's immense coal-producing landscape. At its peak, it was a complete community built around a mine and all the support systems that kept a mining population in place: housing, school, church, company services, and a local culture shaped by work underground. For decades, that structure held. Coalwood functioned as so many southern West Virginia towns did, with the mine serving as both employer and organizing principle. But the place became widely known for another reason entirely. In the late 1950s, a teenager named Homer Hickam looked toward the sky after the launch of Sputnik and became obsessed with rockets. In a town built on coal, he and his friends began experimenting with science, failure, trial and error, and eventually success. That story would later become famous through his memoir and its film adaptation, turning Coalwood into something more than just another coal town. And that contrast is what makes Coalwood unforgettable. It is a place rooted in one of the oldest extractive systems in Appalachia, yet it also became the backdrop for a story about reaching beyond it. While the mine represented labor, danger, and inherited expectation, the rocket story represented curiosity and escape. Both were real. Both came from the same valley. The mine eventually closed in the 1980s, and the town declined sharply. Buildings disappeared, population dropped. The industrial structures that once defined the town were removed or left to deteriorate. What remains now is thinner, quieter, and much closer to the edge of disappearance than the famous story might lead people to expect. Coalwood survives in memory, partly because one boy looked up instead of down. Without that many people outside West Virginia might never have heard of it at all. Number 2. Gary, McDowell County. Gary was not just a town, it was a network, a corporate-built world at a scale that is hard to imagine now. Established by U.S. Steel in the early 20th century, Gary and its surrounding communities formed one of the largest coal town systems in the region. At its height, the population across the complex reached into the many thousands. There were schools, churches, stores, recreation, medical services, and infrastructure designed to keep life functioning within a company-centered environment. That scale matters because it shows how much confidence industry once had in the permanence of coal. You do not build a place like Gary if you think you're setting up something temporary. You build it because you believe the seams, the markets, and the institutions around them will hold for generations. For some time, that seemed true. Families came from different regions and countries. Children grew up in a place with its own routines, loyalties, and expectations. It was a coal empire expressed in neighborhood form. Then the collapse came in stages. As profitable seams declined and the coal economy shifted, layoffs mounted, closures accelerated. By the early 1980s, major job cuts devastated the area and the mines shut down. Unemployment exploded. Population drained away. A place that had once supported an enormous industrial community shrank with shocking speed. That kind of collapse is not just economic. It tears at schools, churches, local businesses, and every relationship built on the assumption that people will still be there next year. The remnants of Gary still carry that weight. Some buildings remain. Some neighborhoods have dissolved almost completely. Roads run past places where community life used to be dense, and the scale of what was lost is hard to process unless you know what stood there before. Gary is one of the strongest examples in West Virginia of how a place can go from central to nearly forgotten within a single lifetime. Number 1. Whipple, Fayette County. If one place on this list captures the entire logic of the coal camp system in a single building, it may be Whipple. The town itself was part of the mining world that shaped southern West Virginia, but what makes it unforgettable is the surviving company store complex. On the surface, it looks like an old commercial structure. Once you understand what happened inside it, it becomes something much more revealing. Whipple grew as a coal camp in the New River Field, and like many towns of its kind, it was built less as an independent community than as an extension of the company that owned the mine. That distinction matters. A normal town grows in layers, different businesses appear, property changes hands, civic life develops somewhat independently, and the place slowly becomes bigger than any one employer. A coal camp like Whipple was different from the beginning. Its streets, housing, supply chains, and even many of its personal routines were shaped by the needs of extraction. It was a place engineered around labor. It is not just an abandoned place. It is a blueprint of dependence. Birth, sickness, debt, hunger, work, injury, and death all moved through a single structure tied directly to the employer. If you wanted to explain the coal camp system to someone who had never heard of it, you could do it by standing in front of this building and saying, "This is how complete the control could be. This is how thoroughly one company could shape a family's life." West Virginia is laced with places like these. Communities that once throbbed with work whistles and front porch nights, now slipping under ivy and leaf litter. If there's a hollow or forgotten main street you think belongs on this list, name it in the comments. And if you love finding the hidden chapters inside familiar landscapes, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next.